The new restaurant owner mocked a 75-year-old black customer, calling security to remove him. When his son emerged from the kitchen, everyone fell silent. The mirror reflected James Wilson's weathered hands as they adjusted the row of medals on his crisp military uniform. Each pin needed to sit perfectly straight, a habit drilled into him through decades of service. At 75, his fingers weren't as steady as they used to be, but they still remembered the precise movements. "There we go," he muttered, straightening the Distinguished Service Cross one last time. The medal caught the morning light streaming through his bedroom window. James leaned closer to the mirror, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding slightly down his nose as he inspected his appearance. The dark green uniform still fit well, though he'd had it tailored twice since retirement. The gold buttons gleamed against the fabric, and his captain's bar sat exactly where they should on his shoulders. He wore it every Thursday when he visited Tommy's restaurant, not to show off, but because it was part of who he was. 30 years in service had earned him that right. His phone buzzed on the dresser. A text from Tommy. "Morning, Dad. Busy day ahead. See you at lunch?" James smiled, typing back with careful precision. "Wouldn't miss it, son." The drive to Riverside Diner took exactly 12 minutes, just like always. James noticed new graffiti on the Henderson building. Someone had sprayed "No Hate" in bright red letters across the brick. He shook his head slightly, remembering when Mr. Henderson used to keep that wall spotless. The parking lot was half full when he arrived, typical for a Thursday morning. He recognized most of the cars: Mrs. Patterson's blue Civic, Doc Murphy's ancient Volvo. The familiarity of it all settled around him like a comfortable jacket. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around him, along with the quiet murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. "Morning, Captain," called out Earl from his usual booth by the window. The elderly mechanic raised his coffee cup in greeting. "Morning, Earl." James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "How's that transmission treating you?" "Better than my ex-wife." Earl's laugh turned into a wheezy cough. James scanned the restaurant as he made his way to his regular spot. Third booth from the back, the one with the view of both the kitchen door and the parking lot. Standard procedure, even after all these years. Always know your exits. Several regular customers nodded or waved, but there were new faces too. A young waitress he didn't recognize. A busboy who looked barely old enough to drive. And behind the counter, a woman in a sharp business suit who was definitely not old Mr. Chun. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the morning rush with narrowed eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, and her red lipstick matched her manicured nails. When her gaze landed on James, something flickered across her face. A brief tightening around the eyes, a slight downturn of her mouth. James settled into his booth, his movements measured and deliberate. Sarah, his regular waitress for the past 5 years, approached with a pot of coffee. Her usual bright smile seemed strained. "Morning, Captain Wilson," she said, filling his cup. Her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops on the table. "Sorry about that." "No harm done, Sarah." He watched as she quickly wiped up the spill. "Everything all right?" She glanced over her shoulder at the woman in the suit. "Oh, just one of those days. The usual breakfast? Please." He noticed how she kept shifting her weight from foot to foot, something she did when nervous. "Tommy in the kitchen today?" "He's in a meeting right now." "With?" Sarah nodded subtly toward the counter. "The new owner." Ah, that explained the suit. James had heard rumors that Mr. Chun was selling the place, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. He watched as the new owner spoke sharply to the young busboy, who scurried away looking flustered. "She's been here about a week," Sarah continued, her voice low. "Making lots of changes." James nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. It was stronger than usual, more bitter. Another change, apparently. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating long shadows across the checkered floor. James observed as the new owner made her way around the counter, speaking to customers. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and she seemed to be calculating something with each interaction. When she reached Earl's table, her voice carried clearly. "Is everything satisfactory today, sir?" "Fine as frog's hair," Earl replied, using one of his favorite expressions. The owner's polite smile faltered for a moment, clearly not understanding the colloquialism. She was making her way through the restaurant, table by table, in what appeared to be a practiced routine. Each time she stopped, her smile became a little more forced, her questions a little more clipped. James pulled out his worn leather wallet, opening it to the photo section. Tommy smiled back at him from a recent snapshot, standing proudly in front of the restaurant's kitchen. His son had worked his way up from dishwasher to manager over the past decade, putting himself through business school at night. The pride James felt whenever he thought about it warmed him more than any medal ever could. The owner was getting closer to his booth. She'd stopped at a table with a young family, commenting on their children's behavior in a tone that suggested criticism wrapped in politeness. The parents quickly hushed their kids, the mother's face flushing with embarrassment. James took another sip of his now lukewarm coffee, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. But decades of military service had taught him to recognize brewing tensions. The air in the restaurant had changed, becoming charged with an undercurrent of discomfort that reminded him of moments before storms broke over far-off deserts. Sarah returned with his breakfast. Eggs over easy, hash browns extra crispy, wheat toast, and a side of fruit that Tommy always insisted he eat. But before she could set the plate down, the owner's voice cut through the air. "Excuse me," she said sharply, stepping up to their table. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah froze, the plate hovering inches above the table. James looked up, meeting the owner's gaze directly. Her eyes flickered over his uniform, his medals, his face, in quick succession. "No problem at all, ma'am," James replied evenly. "Just having my usual breakfast." The owner's red lips pressed into a thin line. "Your usual breakfast? I don't believe we've met. I'm Karen Matthews, the new owner of this establishment." The way she emphasized new owner made it clear that old routines meant nothing to her. James maintained his composed expression, decades of military discipline serving him well. "James Wilson, ma'am. I'm a regular customer here." "My son, a regular customer?" She cut him off, her voice taking on an edge that drew attention from nearby tables. "I've been reviewing our regular customer lists, and I don't recall seeing your name." The restaurant had grown quieter. Earl's coffee cup clinked loudly as he set it down, turning to watch the interaction. Sarah still stood frozen, holding James's breakfast plate, her knuckles white against the ceramic. "I've been coming here every Thursday for the past 10 years, James explained calmly. "My son, Tommy, he's the—" "I find that hard to believe," Karen interrupted again. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down once more, lingering on his uniform in a way that made it clear she was questioning its authenticity. "We have certain standards here now. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else?" The silence in the restaurant had become absolute. Even the kitchen's sounds had ceased, as if the whole building was holding its breath. James sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged, though his right hand had unconsciously moved to touch the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest, a gesture that had become habit in moments of stress. He'd faced down enemy fire with less tension than he felt in this moment. Sarah finally found her voice. "Ms. Matthews, Captain Wilson is absolutely irregular." "He's—" "Sarah," Karen snapped, "don't you have other tables to attend to?" The plate in Sarah's hands trembled again, but she stood her ground. "But he's— That will be all, Sarah." Karen's tone left no room for argument. James watched as Sarah reluctantly placed his breakfast on the table and stepped back, shooting him an apologetic look before hurrying away. The eggs had shifted during the exchange, the yolks broken and bleeding across the white plate. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but the warm familiarity of the restaurant had vanished, replaced by something cold and sharp that hung in the air like invisible frost. James could feel the eyes of other customers on him, could hear the whispered conversations starting up. He'd faced discrimination before, more times than he cared to count. But something about this moment, in this place that had been like a second home for so long, cut deeper than usual. Still, his military bearing held firm as he looked up at Karen Matthews, his voice steady and clear. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll allow me to explain, I don't believe any explanation is necessary," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "I think it's best if you leave. Now." The morning sun caught his metals again, sending little flashes of light across the table. James Wilson sat straight in his booth. Every inch the decorated captain he was, facing yet another battle he never expected to fight. James Wilson reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his wallet again. The leather was soft and worn, cracked at the edges from years of use. He opened it slowly, deliberately, aware of Karen Matthews still standing over him with her arms crossed. "These are some photos I'd like you to see," he said, keeping his voice level. His fingers, steady now with purpose, pulled out a small stack of photographs. "I don't need to see," Karen started, but James continued as if she hadn't spoken. "This one here," he said, laying down the first photo on the table, "is from the day Tommy became manager. That's him with old Mr. Chun." The photograph showed Tommy Wilson, beaming in a crisp white chef's coat, standing next to the elderly Mr. Chun in front of the restaurant's kitchen. Both men were smiling broadly, Mr. Chin's hand resting proudly on Tommy's shoulder. Karen glanced at the photo, then quickly away, her jaw tightening. "Anyone can have photos. That doesn't prove." "And this one," James continued, placing another photo beside the first, "is from last Christmas. The staff party." The image showed Tommy surrounded by the restaurant employees, including Sarah, all wearing Santa hats and ugly sweaters. A muscle twitched in Karen's cheek. She looked around the restaurant, seeming to notice for the first time how many people were watching. Several customers had their phones out, recording the interaction. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping lower but maintaining its edge, "I'm going to have to insist." The kitchen door swung open. The young busboy stuck his head out, looking nervous. Ms. Matthews? There's a situation in the kitchen that needs your attention." "Not now," she snapped, turning back to James. "As I was saying, it's about the health inspection," the busboy blurted out. "They're here early and—" "Fine." Karen's composure cracked slightly. She pointed a red-nailed finger at James. "Don't go anywhere. This isn't finished." She strode toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. As soon as the door swung shut behind her, the restaurant erupted in hushed conversations. Earl slid out of his booth and walked over to James's table, his movements stiff with arthritis, but purposeful. "That ain't right, Captain. Not right at all." "No, it's not," James agreed quietly, looking down at the photos spread on the table. He pulled out another one, Tommy's high school graduation. James in his uniform, Tommy in his cap and gown, both of them grinning at the camera. Sarah approached the table again, coffee pot in hand. Her hands were steady now, anger apparently overcoming her nervousness. "I tried to call Tommy's office twice," she said, topping off James's cup. "He must still be in that meeting." "Thank you, Sarah." James picked up his fork, cutting into the now-cold eggs. He'd eaten worse in the field. Much worse. More customers had gathered near his booth. Mrs. Patterson from the beauty salon next door stood with her hand over her heart, shaking her head. "I've known Tommy since he was washing dishes after school," she said. "How dare she treat his father this way?" James ate methodically, each bite measured and precise, as the crowd around his table grew. He could hear snippets of conversations. Decorated veteran. "Tommy's father. Who does she think she is?" The kitchen door swung open again. Karen emerged, looking slightly flustered but trying to hide it behind a mask of authority. She stopped short when she saw the gathering around James's table. "This is unacceptable," she announced, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "If you're not eating, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Nobody moved. Earl crossed his arms, his old mechanic's overalls streaked with fresh grease. "We are eating. Just having a nice conversation with our friend here." Karen's face flushed. "I'm calling security." She pulled out her phone and walked to the counter, speaking in sharp, clipped tones. James continued eating, his movements unhurried. He learned long ago that panic never improved a situation. The young busboy approached the table cautiously, leaning in to whisper to Sarah. "Tommy's still in his office. Ms. Matthews told us not to disturb him during the investor meeting." James nodded slightly, acknowledging the information without commenting. He pulled out one more photo from his wallet, this one older, creased from being handled often. It showed a much younger James in his combat uniform. holding a toddler-aged Tommy on his shoulders. Both of them wore wide, unguarded smiles that spoke of simpler times. The front door chimed as two security guards entered. They were young, probably moonlighting college students, and looked uncomfortable as Karen pointed them toward James's table. "That's him," she said loudly. "I want him removed." The taller guard stepped forward, then stopped abruptly as he noticed James's uniform and medals. He looked back at his partner, uncertainty clear on his face. "Sir," the guard said, shifting his weight from foot to foot, "we've been asked to remove a decorated veteran from a public establishment." Earl's voice was sharp with anger. "For eating breakfast?" The guard's partner stepped up. "Ma'am," he addressed Karen. I don't pay you to think," Karen snapped. "Remove him. Now." James carefully wiped his mouth with his napkin and looked up at the guards. "Young men," he said calmly, "I understand you're just doing your job. But before you proceed, you should know that my son, Tommy Wilson, is the manager of this restaurant." The guards looked at each other again. The taller one cleared his throat. "Ms. Matthews, maybe we should verify. You're all trespassing." Karen's voice had risen, taking on a shrill edge. "This is my restaurant now, and I want him out." "Your restaurant?" A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned toward the kitchen door. Tommy Wilson stood there, still in his business casual meeting attire, a look of confused anger on his face. "What's going on out here, Dad?" James watched as the color drained from Karen's face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Son," James said quietly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding with the new owner." Tommy strode across the restaurant, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harder. "Ms. Matthews," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "May I speak with you in my office?" "Now!" Karen stood frozen for a moment, her face cycling through several expressions before settling on a desperate attempt at professional composure. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. I was just... now," Tommy repeated, already turning toward his office. Karen followed, her heels no longer clicking quite so confidently against the floor. The security guards backed away, muttering apologies. The crowd around James's table began to disperse, though people kept glancing his way, some offering words of support or gentle pats on his shoulder as they returned to their seats. James looked down at the photos spread across his table, snapshots of a life built on service, sacrifice, and love. His fingers brushed across the old photo of Tommy on his shoulders, remembering the weight of his son, the sound of his laughter. The morning sun had risen higher now, its light filling the restaurant with an almost harsh clarity. James could hear raised voices coming from Tommy's office, muffled but clearly angry. He began carefully gathering his photos, sliding them back into his wallet with the same precision he used for everything else. Sarah appeared at his table again, this time with a fresh plate of eggs. "On the house, Captain," she said firmly. "And cooked right this time?" The voices from Tommy's office grew louder, sharp enough now that fragments of conversation carried across the restaurant. James focused on his fresh plate of eggs, maintaining his dignified composure even as other customers turned their heads toward the sound of the argument. "Absolutely unacceptable." Tommy's voice cut through clearly. "Didn't know." Karen's response was defensive. "My father." The words were followed by the sound of something being slammed. The kitchen door swung open, and several cooks peered out, watching the office door with undisguised interest. The young busboy had stopped pretending to clean tables, standing frozen with a rag in his hand. James cut his eggs with military precision, each movement measured and controlled. The yolks ran golden across the white plate, and he used his toast to dam the flow, just as he'd done every Thursday for the past decade. The office door flew open. Tommy emerged first, his face set in hard lines that made him look more like his father than ever. Karen followed, her professional demeanor cracking around the edges. Her perfectly styled hair had come slightly loose, and her face was flushed. "Everyone," Tommy announced, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "May I have your attention, please?" Heads turned. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to quiet. "I want to apologize for the disruption this morning," Tommy continued. And I want to make something very clear. He gestured toward James. This man is my father. He's a decorated war veteran who served this country for 30 years. He's also been a loyal customer of this restaurant for the past decade. Karen stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. Wilson, if I had known. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Tommy cut her off. You shouldn't need to know who someone's related to in order to treat them with basic respect. The restaurant remained silent, but James could feel the energy shift. People were nodding, some pulling out their phones again to record. Dad, Tommy said, turning to James. I'm so sorry this happened. James set down his fork carefully. No need to apologize, son. These things happen. No. Tommy's voice was firm. These things shouldn't happen. Not here. Not anywhere. Karen cleared her throat. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I think we're past private discussion, Tommy said. He turned to address the restaurant again. As general manager of this establishment, I want to make it clear that discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated here. Mr. Wilson, Karen's voice had taken on a desperate edge. As the owner, partial owner, Tommy corrected. You bought Mr. Chin's 60% stake. The remaining 40% belongs to me. This was clearly news to Karen. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. That's not. The paperwork didn't. Check your documents again, Tommy said. Mr. Chun made me a partner 3 years ago, which means I have a say in how this place is run. He paused, looking around the restaurant. And I say we don't discriminate against anyone. Ever. James watched the scene unfold with the same steady gaze he'd maintained through countless military briefings and combat situations. He noticed Sarah standing nearby, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. Earl had retaken his seat but was leaning forward, nodding at Tommy's words. The front door chimed. A group of people walked in, led by a woman holding a microphone and followed by a man with a camera on his shoulder. Local news, based on the station logo on their jackets. We received reports of a veteran being discriminated against, the reporter asked, looking around the restaurant. Karen's face went pale. She turned to Tommy, her voice low and urgent. Mr. Wilson, please. My reputation should reflect your actions, Tommy finished for her. He walked over to James's table and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Dad, you don't have to stay for this if you don't want to. James looked up at his son, pride warming his chest. I've never run from a fight, Tommy. Not about to start now. The reporter approached their table, microphone extended. Sir, would you be willing to tell us what happened here this morning? Before James could respond, the kitchen doors burst open again. This time, the entire kitchen staff emerged, cooks, dishwashers, prep workers, all still in their aprons and chef's coats. We all saw it, said Mike, the head cook who'd worked alongside Tommy for years. We saw everything, and we got it on video, added another cook holding up his phone. Karen's professional facade crumbled completely. This is ridiculous. I was merely trying to maintain certain standards. Standards? Tommy's voice was sharp. What standards exactly? The color of someone's skin? The way they look? Is that how you want this restaurant to be known? The camera was rolling now, capturing every word. Other customers had their phones out too, recording the confrontation from multiple angles. James stood up slowly, his movement drawing all eyes in the restaurant. His uniform was still perfectly pressed, his medals catching the late morning sun. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. Ma'am, he addressed Karen directly. I've served this country through 3 conflicts. I've seen men and women of every color, every background, fight and die for the freedoms we enjoy, including the freedom to eat breakfast wherever we choose. The reporter moved closer, making sure to catch every word. I've been coming to this restaurant every Thursday for 10 years, James continued. I watched my son work his way up from dishwasher to partner. I've seen this place become part of the community, and I've learned that respect isn't something you earn by looking a certain way or knowing the right people. It's something you give freely, to everyone, or it means nothing at all. The restaurant erupted in applause. Karen stood frozen, the sound washing over her like a wave. Tommy squeezed his father's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. The reporter turned to Karen. Would you care to comment on the situation? Karen looked around wildly, seeing nothing but condemning faces. The security guards had long since disappeared. Her carefully constructed authority had crumbled, leaving her exposed under the harsh restaurant lights and rolling cameras. She started, then stopped. For the first time that morning, she seemed to really look at James, not just his uniform or his skin, but the man himself. Something shifted in her expression. I made a terrible mistake. Yes, Tommy said quietly. You did? The front door chimed again. This time, a group of veterans entered, some in uniform, others wearing caps and jackets that identified their service. Word had spread quickly through the community. James recognized several faces from the local VFW post. They filed in silently, forming a line of solidarity that stretched from the door to his table. The morning sun had reached its peak now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene in stark clarity. The proud son standing by his father, the humbled owner facing the consequences of her actions, the community united in support, and at the center of it all, a decorated veteran who had faced this battle with the same dignity he'd shown in all the others. The lunch crowd started filtering in, mixing with the breakfast customers who had stayed to witness the unfolding situation. The news crew had set up in a corner booth, conducting interviews with regular customers and staff. Their camera kept returning to James, who remained at his table, a calm center in the storm of activity. Captain Wilson, the reporter, approached his table again. Would you be willing to share more about your military service? Before James could respond, Tommy stepped in. Dad, you don't have to. It's all right, son. James gestured for the reporter to sit. She slid into the booth across from him, placing her microphone on the table. When I enlisted in 1969, James began, his voice steady. Things were different, but not as different as some might think. The camera focused on his medals as he spoke. His fingers brushed the Distinguished Service Cross. This one, he said, was earned in '71. Our unit was pinned down outside Saigon. Lost some good men that day. White men, black men, bullets didn't care about color. Karen stood at the counter, watching and listening like everyone else. Her earlier arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like shame. After Vietnam, James continued, I stayed in, served in Desert Storm, Iraq, trained hundreds of young soldiers. And you know what I learned? He leaned forward slightly. Character isn't about what you look like. It's about what you do when things get hard. The reporter nodded. And what happened here today? Just another battle, James said simply. Different field, same fight. Tommy, who had been talking quietly with the kitchen staff, walked over to Karen. Their conversation was too low to hear, but their body language spoke volumes. Tommy's stance was firm, authoritative. Karen kept nodding, her earlier confidence completely deflated. The bell above the door chimed again. Colonel Marcus Stewart walked in, his dress uniform as crisp as James's. The two men had served together in Desert Storm. Wilson, the colonel called out, making his way through the crowded restaurant. Heard you could use some backup. James stood, exchanging a proper military salute with his old friend. Situation's under control, sir. So I see. Colonel Stewart surveyed the scene, the news crew, the gathered veterans, the chastened owner. Still thought I'd drop by, show some support. The reporter's eyes lit up at the arrival of another high-ranking veteran. Colonel, would you care to comment on today's events? Well, Stewart adjusted his tie. When I heard someone was disrespecting Captain Wilson, I could hardly believe it. This man, he placed a hand on James's shoulder, saved my life in '91. Led a rescue mission behind enemy lines. Never left a man behind, regardless of rank or race. The camera captured every word. Karen had moved closer, listening. Thing is, Stewart continued, respect isn't just about saluting medals. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through your door. He turned to face Karen directly, something any business owner should understand. Tommy approached with fresh coffee for both veterans. Colonel Stewart, good to see you. Tommy, Stewart smiled. Your father here never stops bragging about you. Manager and part owner now, I hear. Yes, sir. Tommy set down the coffee cups. Though apparently, some people had trouble believing that. Karen flinched at the comment. She'd been trying to make herself inconspicuous near the counter. But there was no hiding from the situation she'd created. The lunch rush was picking up now, with more customers arriving. Many stopped short when they saw the news crew and the gathering of veterans, phones coming out to record the scene. James sipped his coffee, the familiar routine a stark contrast to the extraordinary circumstances. He'd faced discrimination before, in the service, in civilian life, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't standing alone. "Remember Sergeant Mills?" Stewart asked, settling into the booth. "Back in '91? James nodded. "How could I forget?" "Share that story, Captain," Stewart encouraged. "People should hear it." James set down his coffee cup. The reporter leaned forward, microphone ready. "We were pinned down outside Basra," James began. "Sergeant Mills was hit bad. Enemy fire was heavy. Some of the younger soldiers were hesitating. Not because Mills was black, but because getting to him meant crossing 50 yards of open ground. The restaurant had gone quiet again, everyone listening. I gave the order to provide covering fire, and ran out to get him myself. Bullets flying everywhere. Carried him back to our position. He survived." James paused, looking directly at Karen. "Never occurred to me to think about anything except that a fellow soldier needed help. That's what real leadership looks like," Stewart added. "That's what character looks like." Karen finally stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but carried in the silence. "Captain Wilson, I owe you an apology." James turned to face her, his expression neutral but attentive. "I made assumptions," she continued. "Terrible, unfair assumptions. I forgot that a business isn't just about profits or appearances. It's about people." She glanced at Tommy. "All people? MS. Matthews." James replied evenly. "In my experience, apologies mean little without action to back them up." "You're right." She straightened her shoulders. "Which is why I'd like to announce some changes." She looked around the restaurant, addressing everyone. "First, we'll be implementing a new anti-discrimination policy. Tommy will help draft it. Second, we'll be starting a Veterans Appreciation Program. And third," she took a deep breath, "I'll be attending sensitivity training, personally." The reporter's eyebrows rose. "May we quote you on that?" "Yes," Karen said firmly. "I want to be held accountable." Tommy watched his father's reaction carefully. James maintained his composure, but those who knew him well could see the slight softening around his eyes. "It's a start," James said finally. Colonel Stewart checked his watch. "Well, I believe it's time for lunch. Tommy, think you could rustle up some meals for a couple of old soldiers?" "Of course, sir." Tommy signaled to the kitchen. "Dad's usual?" James nodded, then looked at Karen. "If that's acceptable to management?" She flushed but held her ground. "Your money's no good here today, Captain. For either of you." "No," James said firmly. "I'll pay my bills same as always." "Respect goes both ways, ma'am." The reporter was still taking notes, capturing every detail. The story had evolved from one of discrimination to something more complex, a lesson in dignity, leadership, and the possibility of change. The lunch crowd began placing orders, life in the restaurant slowly returning to normal. But something had shifted, something fundamental. The air felt clearer, as if a long-standing fog had finally lifted. The lunch service was in full swing now, but it wasn't business as usual. The news crew had set up additional cameras, conducting interviews with customers and staff. The veterans who had arrived earlier remained, scattered throughout the restaurant in a show of quiet solidarity. Tommy emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 plates. He'd removed his manager's blazer and rolled up his sleeves, falling back into the hands-on role he'd never fully abandoned despite his position. "Meatloaf special," he announced, setting the plates in front of James and Colonel Stewart. "Just like Mom used to make." "Better, I hope," James said with a slight smile. "Your mother was many things, but a cook wasn't one of them." The 3 men shared a knowing laugh, remembering Clara Wilson's notorious attempts at meatloaf that had more in common with building materials than food. Karen approached their table again, her movements hesitant but determined. "Mr. Wilson, Tommy, could we speak privately for a moment?" Tommy glanced at his father, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "5 minutes," Tommy said, following Karen to a quiet corner near the register. James cut into his meatloaf, the comfort food a stark contrast to the morning's tension. "Your son's done well for himself," Colonel Stewart observed, watching Tommy handle the situation with professional grace. He has, James agreed. Clara would be proud. The news reporter, who had been interviewing other customers, drifted back toward their table. Captain Wilson, we've been hearing some remarkable stories about your history with this restaurant. Would you mind telling us how your son came to work here? James set down his fork, weighing his words carefully. Tommy was 16. Wanted to buy a car. I told him he needed to earn it himself. Build some character. He smiled at the memory. He walked into every business in town looking for work. Mr. Chun was the only one who gave him a chance. Started as a dishwasher, right? The reporter prompted. Yes, ma'am. Came home every night soaked to the bone, smelling like old food. But he never complained. Worked his way through high school, then college. Mr. Chun saw something in him. Same thing I always saw. Across the restaurant, the conversation between Tommy and Karen had grown more intense. Tommy's voice carried slightly. Not just about today. The kitchen door swung open, and Mike the head cook emerged, carrying a thick binder. He walked directly to Tommy and Karen, his face set in determined lines. Found it, Mike announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Every complaint filed in the past 2 weeks. Karen's face paled. That's confidential. No, ma'am. Mike cut her off. These are official incident reports. Policy requires they be available for review by any member of management. He opened the binder, including complaints about discriminatory practices. The reporter's head snapped up. Her cameraman was already moving, capturing the new development. Mike, Tommy said quietly. How many? 17, Mike replied. All documented. All since MS. Matthews took over. The restaurant had gone quiet again. James continued eating his meatloaf, each bite measured and deliberate, but his eyes never left his son. 17 cases of discrimination, the reporter clarified, moving closer to the group. Refusing service, Mike read from the binder. Unfair treatment. Harassment. All targeting specific groups of customers. Karen's professional facade cracked completely. Those were legitimate business decisions, like refusing service to Mrs. Rodriguez because her children were speaking Spanish. Mike's voice was sharp. Or making Mr. Patel eat in the back corner because other customers might be uncomfortable ? Colonel Stewart set down his fork with a decisive click. Systematic discrimination, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. Not just an isolated incident. Tommy took the binder from Mike, flipping through the pages with growing anger. Why wasn't I shown these? They were intercepted, Mike said. We were told not to bother you with minor customer issues. The veterans scattered throughout the restaurant had begun to stand, their presence becoming more pronounced. James remained seated, but his posture had straightened imperceptibly, years of military bearing taking over. Karen looked around wildly, seeing the situation spiral further out of control. I was trying to create an upscale atmosphere by excluding people who don't fit your image of upscale ? Tommy's voice was quiet, but carried clearly. Like my father? The front door chimed again. Mr. Chen walked in, his small frame somehow filling the doorway. The elderly restaurateur surveyed the scene with sharp eyes. Ah, he said simply. I see the truth comes out. Mr. Chun, Karen started, but he held up a hand. I sold you majority share, he said, his accent thick but his words precise, because you show good business plan. Numbers all good. He walked further into the restaurant, nodding to regular customers he recognized. But business, not just numbers. Business is people. He reached James's table, bowing slightly. Captain Wilson, so sorry this happened in my old restaurant. Not your fault, Mr. Chun, James replied, standing to shake the older man's hand. No, Mr. Chun agreed. But maybe my responsibility. He turned to face Karen. Contract have interesting clause. Page 12, paragraph 4. Karen's eyes widened. What? Moral conduct clause? Tommy said suddenly. Dad helped me review the contract last month. It gives the minority shareholder power to force a buyback in cases of gross misconduct. The reporter's eyes lit up. Are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, Mr. Chen said calmly. I state facts. 17 documented cases of discrimination, plus today's incident caught on camera. He smiled, but there was steel behind it. My lawyer will call your lawyer. The restaurant erupted in murmurs. Karen sank into a nearby chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "Mr. Chun," Tommy said, "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," the old man replied. "Just keep running restaurant right way. Like I teach you." He walked over to Karen. "You have choice now. Sell back shares quietly or—" He gestured to the news crew, "become famous for wrong reasons." James watched the scene unfold, still standing at his table. The meatloaf was getting cold, but some things were more important than a hot lunch. "Son," he called out. Tommy turned. "Your mother would be proud, not just of what you've achieved, but how you've achieved it." Tommy walked back to his father's table, emotion clear on his face. The reporter's camera followed him, but for once, he didn't seem to care about maintaining his professional demeanor. "I learned from the best, Dad," he said, his voice thick. "You always said character reveals itself in how we treat others, and in how we respond to those who treat us poorly," James added, looking directly at Karen. The lunch crowd had thinned, but no one seemed eager to leave. They were witnessing something important, not just the exposure of discrimination, but the power of dignity in the face of it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the restaurant windows as more people began arriving. Word had spread quickly through the small community, and the parking lot was filling up with cars and news vans from other local stations. A group of veterans from the VFW post had set up an impromptu honor guard near the entrance. Each time the door opened, their presence served as a reminder that this was no ordinary afternoon at Riverside Diner. "Look at this," Colonel Stewart said, holding up his phone. Local social media was exploding with the story. Videos of the morning's confrontation had already gone viral, spreading far beyond their small town. James finished the last bite of his now-cold meatloaf. "Never thought I'd be trending at my age," he said quietly. The bell above the door chimed again. Mayor Thompson walked in, followed by several members of the city council. They paused at the entrance, taking in the scene, the gathered veterans, the news crews, Mr. Chun and Tommy still confronting Karen near the register. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "I believe we need to address this situation formally." Tommy stepped forward. "Madam Mayor, I apologize for the disruption." "No apologies needed, Mr. Wilson," she cut him off. "In fact, I believe it's the city that owes you and your father an apology." Karen stood up straighter. "Mayor Thompson, if I could explain." "Ms. Matthews," the mayor's voice was sharp. "I've seen the videos. I've read the incident reports. And I've just gotten off the phone with the Chamber of Commerce." She turned to address the whole restaurant. "Discrimination has no place in our community. Not today, not ever." One of the council members stepped forward, holding a folder. "We're prepared to launch a formal investigation into all reported incidents." The color drained from Karen's face. "That's not necessary. Actually," Tommy interrupted, "it is." He held up Mike's binder. "These complaints deserve to be heard. All of them." James watched from his table as the situation continued to evolve. More customers were arriving, many carrying handmade signs. "Veterans welcome here. No place for hate. Respect for all." Sarah weaved through the crowd with fresh coffee, stopping at James's table. "Captain Wilson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something you should know." She pulled out her phone, showing him a local news website. The headline read, "Decorated Veteran Faced Discrimination. Community Rallies." "It's not just local anymore," she continued. "National news picked it up. You're trending on Twitter." James adjusted his glasses, looking at the screen. The video of his confrontation with Karen had millions of views already. Comments poured in from across the country. "This is how you handle hate, with dignity. That uniform represents all of us. Thank you for your service, Captain Wilson." The mayor approached James's table. "Captain, would you be willing to speak at an emergency town hall meeting this evening? I think our community needs to hear from you." Before James could respond, the door chimed again. Mrs. Rodriguez entered with her children, the family mentioned in the incident reports. Behind them came Mr. Patel, and then more faces James recognized from the neighborhood. People who had faced similar treatment, but hadn't known they weren't alone. "This is bigger than just today," Tommy said, watching the crowd grow. "This is about every person who's ever been made to feel unwelcome because of who they are." Karen stood isolated near the counter, watching as her actions unleashed a wave of response she clearly hadn't anticipated. Mr. Chin approached her again. "In my country," he said quietly, "I face much discrimination. Come here for American dream. Dream not just about money, about dignity, respect." He gestured around the restaurant. "Look what you create with your actions. Community come together. Stand up against hate." The mayor had taken center stage near the counter. "I'm calling an emergency session of the city council," she announced. "We're going to draft new anti-discrimination ordinances for all businesses in our community. And," she turned to Tommy, "we'd like your help writing them." The crowd applauded. Tommy looked at his father, who nodded slightly. "I'd be honored," Tommy said. "But I think we need to hear from everyone affected. Every story matters." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her children clutching her hands. "Last week," she began, her voice shaking, "my children were told they couldn't speak Spanish in here, that it made other customers uncomfortable." Mr. Patel joined her. "I was seated in the back, behind a partition, told it was the only table available, even though the restaurant was nearly empty." More people began sharing their stories. Each account added to the weight of evidence, the pattern of discrimination becoming impossible to ignore. James stood slowly, his uniform still crisp despite the long day. The room fell silent as he walked to the center of the restaurant. "When I was serving," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I learned that unity isn't about everyone being the same. It's about standing together despite our differences." He looked around the room, meeting eyes of different colors, faces of different shapes. "This restaurant was a second home to my son, to me, to many of you. Today, we have a choice. We can let hatred divide us, or we can use this moment to build something better." The mayor nodded. "Captain Wilson is right. This isn't just about one incident or one restaurant. This is about who we are as a community." Tommy stepped up beside his father. "Starting tomorrow, we're going to make changes. Real changes." He turned to Karen. "Ms. Matthews, you have a decision to make. You can be part of the solution, or I'll sell," Karen said suddenly. The room fell silent again. "Mr. Chun, I'll take your buyback offer." She looked around the restaurant, at the faces of those she'd wronged. "And I'm truly sorry." To everyone, Mr. Chin nodded solemnly. "Good choice. First step on long road." The afternoon light had begun to fade, but the restaurant was brighter than ever with the energy of community in action. Plans were being made, stories were being shared, and something new was being built from the ashes of prejudice. James returned to his table, where his cold coffee still waited. Colonel Stewart raised his cup in a subtle salute. "Well done, Captain," Stewart said quietly. "Another victory for the good guys." James shook his head slightly. "No victory yet, Colonel. Just the beginning of another battle. One worth fighting." Through the windows, they could see more people arriving, carrying more signs, more stories, more determination to make things right. The small restaurant had become ground zero for something much bigger than a single act of discrimination. It had become a rallying point for change. The evening sun cast an amber glow through the restaurant windows as the impromptu community meeting continued. Tables had been pushed together to create a makeshift conference area, with the mayor at one end and Tommy at the other. James sat quietly beside his son, watching as people lined up to share their experiences. "The meeting at City Hall starts in an hour," Mayor Thompson announced, checking her watch. "But I think we need to hear these stories first." A young woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she gripped a piece of paper. "My name is Maria Sanchez," she began. "Last week, I was told my Quinceañera celebration couldn't be held here because it might disturb other customers." Tommy made a note in the incident binder. "That's number 18, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Karen sat in a corner booth, still present but diminished, watching as the impact of her policies unfolded before her. Mr. Chan had positioned himself near her, not as a guard but as a witness. "Ms. Sanchez," James spoke up, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command. "Would you like to reschedule your celebration?" Maria looked up, surprised. "Sir?" "Tommy," James turned to his son, "I believe we could host a proper Quinceañera here. If Ms. Sanchez would give us the honor." Tommy's face broke into a smile, the first real one since the morning's confrontation. Of course. And he looked around the room, considerate on the house. A new beginning for this place. The crowd murmured approval. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Captain Wilson. Mr. Wilson. Next order of business, Mayor Thompson said, shuffling through some papers. The City Council has drafted an emergency ordinance requiring all businesses to post clear anti-discrimination policies. We'd like your input, Captain Wilson. James straightened in his chair. Ma'am, with respect, I think others should speak first. He gestured to the line of people waiting to share their stories. Real change starts with listening. An elderly man stepped forward next, leaning on a cane. Name's Harold Washington. Served in Korea. He nodded to James. Been trying to get a job here for months. Always told they weren't hiring. Watched them hire 3 white busboys last week. Mike, the head cook, stood up. That's changing today, sir. We need an experienced host for the dinner shift. Job's yours if you want it. Harold's weathered face broke into a smile. When do I start? How about now? Tommy suggested. We could use some help organizing this town hall. The news crews had never stopped filming, capturing every moment of community transformation. The original reporter approached James again. Captain Wilson, how does it feel to see your personal experience spark such widespread change? James considered the question carefully. It feels like another mission, ma'am. One that's long overdue. Colonel Stewart, who had remained quietly observant, spoke up. You know, Wilson, this reminds me of '73. Remember that night in Saigon? I do. James nodded. The room quieted, sensing a story coming. Our unit was divided, Stewart continued. Racial tensions were high back home, and they followed us overseas. Captain Wilson here gathered everyone together one night. Didn't give a speech about brotherhood or unity. Just shared his rations with everyone, told stories about home. He paused, looking around the room. By morning, we weren't black soldiers and white soldiers anymore. We were just soldiers. Sometimes, James added quietly, the simplest actions speak the loudest. Mayor Thompson checked her watch again. We should head to City Hall soon. But first, she stood, her official demeanor softening. Captain Wilson, Tommy, on behalf of the city, I want to thank you. Not just for exposing these issues, but for showing us how to address them with dignity. Karen rose from her corner booth. Before we go, she said, her voice barely carrying across the room, I have something to say. The crowd parted as she walked to the center of the makeshift meeting area. Her designer suit was wrinkled now, her perfect hair disheveled, but something in her bearing had changed. I came here with spreadsheets and business plans, she began. I thought I could make this place better by making it more exclusive. She swallowed hard. I was wrong. Not just morally wrong, but wrong about what makes a business successful. She turned to face James. Captain Wilson, when you walked in this morning, I saw only what I wanted to see. I failed to see your humanity, your dignity, your service. I failed to see a father coming to visit his son. I failed. As a human being, the room remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. My lawyer will have the buyback paperwork ready tomorrow, she continued. But that's not enough. I'd like to donate my entire profit from the sale to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing business degrees. Tommy leaned forward. MS. Matthews. Please, she held up a hand. Let me finish. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to ensure something good comes from it. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those she'd wronged. The scholarship will be named after Captain Wilson. A reminder that true leadership isn't about exclusion. It's about bringing people together. James stood, his movement drawing all eyes. He walked to Karen, his steps measured and dignified. MS. Matthews, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Redemption isn't found in grand gestures. It's earned through daily actions, through treating each person you meet with respect. He extended his hand. But it's a start. Karen took his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The cameras caught the moment. The decorated veteran and the humbled business owner, bridging a divide that had seemed uncrossable just hours ago. All right, Mayor Thompson called out. City Hall in 15 minutes. This is just the beginning, folks. As people began gathering their things, James noticed Sarah wiping tears from her eyes as she cleared coffee cups. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head, smiling. "No, sir. Something right. Finally right." The evening sun had almost set now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Through the restaurant windows, they could see more people gathering outside, holding candles and signs, waiting to join the march to City Hall. "Dad," Tommy said softly, "ready to lead one more mission?" James straightened his uniform, his medals catching the last rays of sunlight. "Son, some missions never really end. They just change shape." Together, father and son walked toward the door, leading their community toward something that felt like progress, one step at a time. The City Hall steps were crowded with people holding candles, their faces glowing in the deepening twilight. James Wilson stood at the podium, his uniform illuminated by the news camera's lights. The crowd stretched down the street, far beyond the building steps. "I never planned to speak tonight," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Never planned to do anything except have breakfast with my son." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. But life rarely goes according to plan. In combat, we called it adapting to the situation. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Today, our community faced a situation, and now we must adapt. Tommy stood to his father's right, while Mayor Thompson and the city council members sat behind them. The news crews had multiplied. National networks had picked up the story, their satellite trucks lining the street. "When I was serving," James continued, "I learned that change doesn't come from grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It comes from small actions, repeated daily. It comes from choosing respect over hatred, understanding over fear." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the draft of the new anti-discrimination ordinance. "This document," he held it up, "is important. But it's just paper. Real change happens in our hearts, in our daily choices, in how we treat each other when no one's watching." A voice called from the crowd. "Tell them about Sergeant Mills, Captain." James smiled slightly. "Already did at the restaurant. But that story isn't about heroics. It's about doing what's right, regardless of circumstances." He gestured to Tommy. "My son learned that lesson. Started as a dishwasher, worked his way up. Never asked for special treatment. Never expected anything he didn't earn." Tommy stepped forward. "What my father isn't saying is that he taught me those lessons by example. Every day, facing discrimination with dignity, refusing to let hatred dim his light." The mayor rose, joining them at the podium. "The ordinance before us tonight does several things," she announced. "First, it requires all businesses to post clear anti-discrimination policies. Second, it establishes a review board to investigate complaints. Third," she turned to James, "it creates a community oversight committee, which we hope Captain Wilson will chair." James looked surprised. This hadn't been part of the plan. But before he could respond, another voice rang out from the crowd. "I second that nomination." The crowd parted. Harold Washington, the Korean War veteran who'd just been hired at the restaurant, made his way forward, still leaning on his cane. "Been in this town 40 years, Harold said, his voice strong despite his age. "Seen lots of promises, lots of papers signed. But tonight feels different." He looked at James. "Because tonight we have someone who doesn't just talk about change, he lives it." More voices joined in, calling for James to accept the position. He raised his hand for silence. "Before I respond," he said, "I want to hear from others. This isn't about one person's experience. It's about our whole community." Maria Sanchez, the young woman from the restaurant, stepped forward. "My quinceañera is next month," she said. "Thanks to Mr. Wilson and his son, it will be at Riverside Diner." But more importantly, she looked around at the crowd. "For the first time, I feel like I truly belong in this town." Mr. Patel spoke next. "I came here 20 years ago, opened my shop. Some days were good, some bad. But today, seeing everyone stand together," he wiped his eyes. "Today I feel like an American." One by one, people stepped forward to share their stories. Each account added weight to the moment, transforming an ordinary Thursday into something historic. Near the back of the crowd, Karen Matthews stood listening. She had changed out of her designer's suit into simple clothing, as if trying to physically shed her former self. "Ms. Matthews," James called out, surprising everyone. "Would you like to speak?" The crowd parted again as Karen made her way forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. "I thought I was a good person," she began. "I had spreadsheets showing profit margins, plans for improving the restaurant. What I didn't have was wisdom." She turned to face the crowd. "Today, I learned that success isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in dignity, both the dignity we maintain and the dignity we grant others." A murmur of approval rippled through the gathering. James nodded slightly, acknowledging her words. "The scholarship fund I mentioned," Karen continued, "will be administered by a board that includes community members who have faced discrimination. Because change isn't about one person's redemption. It's about creating opportunities for everyone." Mayor Thompson stepped forward again. "The council is ready to vote on the ordinance. But first," she turned to James. "Captain Wilson, will you accept the position of committee chair?" James looked out at the crowd, at Tommy's proud face, at the veterans standing at attention, at the families holding candles, at the young people recording everything on their phones. He saw America in all its beautiful complexity, all its painful history, all its potential for growth. "On one condition," he said finally, "that the committee truly represents our whole community. Every voice matters. Every story counts." The mayor smiled. "I think that can be arranged." As if on cue, the city hall bells began to toll 9 o'clock. The sound rang out across the crowd, mixing with the spontaneous applause that had broken out. "One more thing," James raised his hand again. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be having breakfast at Riverside Diner. Same booth, same time, and I hope to see all of you there. Not because of what happened today, but because that's what community looks like. People sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing lives." Tommy stepped to the microphone. "Free coffee for everyone tomorrow morning." The crowd laughed, the sound carrying up into the night sky. The candles flickered in the gentle breeze, creating a constellation of lights that stretched down the street. James looked at his son, seeing in Tommy's face the future he'd always fought for. A future where character mattered more than color, where dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. The mayor raised the ordinance. "All in favor?" The council members' aye votes were nearly drowned out by the crowd's response. As the paper was signed, cameras flashing to capture the moment, James felt a familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. Not the weight of medals or rank, but of responsibility, of purpose. Some battles, he knew, were fought not with weapons but with wisdom, not with force but with forgiveness, not with hatred but with hope. 1 month later, the morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows of Riverside Diner. New signs hung by the entrance. "All are welcome here. Proud to serve everyone." Veteran-owned and community-driven, James Wilson sat in his usual booth, adjusting his medals out of habit. The restaurant hummed with activity. Every table filled, every seat taken. The smell of coffee and breakfast mingled with the sound of dozens of conversations in multiple languages. "More coffee, Captain?" Harold Washington asked, his new host uniform pressed and proper, name tag gleaming. "Thank you, Harold." James held out his cup. "Busy morning?" "Every morning's busy now," Harold smiled. "Ever since that Thursday." That Thursday. Everyone in town knew which Thursday they meant. The day had become a marker in the community's history, before and after, divided by a single morning that changed everything. The front door chimed. Maria Sanchez entered with her family, still wearing her quinceañera dress from the celebration the night before. The restaurant had been transformed for the event, filled with music, laughter, and dancing until midnight. "Captain Wilson," Maria hurried over, her dress rustling. "Thank you again for everything. It was perfect." "Thank your father's cooking," James smiled. "Those tamales put our regular menu to shame." About that, Tommy appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Mr. Sanchez, got a minute? I'd like to talk about adding some new items to our menu." Maria's father beamed with pride as he followed Tommy to his office. Through the open door, James could see the wall of photos, not just the old ones of Tommy's career, but new ones. Photos from that Thursday, from the City Hall meeting, from Maria's quinceañera. A visual history of change. The kitchen door swung open, and Mike emerged with a special plate. "Captain," he called out, "try this. New breakfast special we're working on. Mr. Patel's family recipe." The dish was a fusion of American and Indian breakfast foods, spiced potatoes, eggs with curry, and naan-bread toast. The aroma drew appreciative looks from nearby tables. "Adding it to the regular menu?" James asked, taking a bite. "If you approve," Mike grinned. "Figure our community oversight chairman should have a say." The oversight committee had been busy. In the past month, they'd reviewed policies at businesses across town, handled complaints, and more importantly, facilitated conversations. Real change, James had learned, happened in quiet moments of understanding. The door chimed again. Karen Matthews walked in, dressed simply, carrying a stack of papers. She kept her word about the scholarship fund, but she'd done more than that. She'd spent the past month visiting local businesses, sharing her story as a cautionary tale, turning her mistake into a lesson others could learn from. "Morning, Captain Wilson," she said, her voice lacking its former artificial polish. "Tommy, got those application forms for the first round of scholarships?" Tommy emerged from his office. "Great, Dad. Want to help review them?" After breakfast, James nodded. He'd insisted that the scholarship committee include students from all backgrounds. Success, he'd said, comes in every color. The restaurant had settled into a new rhythm. Sarah moved between tables, chatting with customers in English and Spanish. Harold greeted everyone with equal warmth. Mike's kitchen staff now resembled a United Nations meeting, producing foods that crossed cultural boundaries. Mr. Chin visited often, always sitting at the counter, always watching with quiet satisfaction. He told James once, "Restaurant like America, many ingredients, one good meal." The bell above the door chimed once more. Colonel Stewart walked in with a group of veterans. Their regular Thursday morning coffee group had grown significantly. "Wilson," Stewart called out, "saw the news this morning?" James shook his head. He'd been at the restaurant since dawn, helping Tommy prepare for the breakfast rush. "3 other towns adopted our ordinance," Stewart said, settling into the booth across from James. "They're calling it the Wilson Rule." James absorbed this information silently, cutting into Mr. Patel's breakfast creation with military precision. "Long as it works," he said finally. "Names don't matter much. Tell that to the governor's office," Stewart grinned. "They want you to speak at the state capitol next week." The restaurant had gone quiet. Everyone was listening, though pretending not to. "Not much for speeches," James said. "No," Stewart agreed. "But you're good at telling the truth. That's what they need to hear." Tommy approached the table, coffee pot in hand. Despite being part owner, he still worked the floor regularly. "He's right, Dad. People listen to you because you don't just talk about dignity, you live it." James looked around the restaurant, at Maria in her quinceañera dress, at Harold greeting customers, at Karen reviewing scholarship applications, at Mr. Patel's family sharing their recipes, at the veterans gathering for coffee. "You know," he said slowly, "in the service we had a saying, mission accomplished. But some missions don't end. They just change." "Like this one?" Tommy asked. "Like this one," James nodded. "Every day is a new mission. Every person who walks through that door is an opportunity to get it right." The morning sun had risen higher, filling the restaurant with warm light. The smell of coffee and conversation, of different foods and shared humanity, created an atmosphere that felt like progress. "Sure you won't give that speech at the Capitol?" Stewart pressed. James straightened his medals, a lifetime of habit. "Might have something to say," he admitted. "About dignity, about change, about how a simple breakfast can start a movement." Tommy refilled their coffee cups. "Tell them about that Thursday?" "No," James said thoughtfully. "Tell them about this Thursday, and next Thursday, and every day in between. Tell them it's not about one moment of standing up. It's about showing up every day, doing what's right." The door chimed again. More customers entered. Families, workers, students, all part of the community that had grown stronger through crisis. "You know, Dad," Tommy said, watching the new arrivals find seats, "when I was washing dishes here as a kid, I never imagined." "Neither did I, son," James smiled. "Neither did I." Harold approached with more coffee. "News crew's outside again, Captain. Want me to tell them you're busy?" "No," James decided. Let them in. Some stories need to be told. Remind people that change is possible, that dignity matters, that every day is a chance to get it right. The morning continued, sunlight streaming through windows that held no barriers, only welcome. In his usual booth, James Wilson, veteran, father, community leader, watched his simple Thursday breakfast become part of something larger, something that felt like hope. Outside, the sign swung gently in the morning breeze. All are welcome here. Inside, America happened, one cup of coffee at a time.